old Australian stockman lying, dying.
They called him Australia's uncle, a man who made children laugh, painted portraits for royalty, and stood on the grandest stages with a wobble board and a grin. But behind that grin, there was something far darker, something that would take decades to emerge. In 2014, the world watched in disbelief as Rolf Harris, one of Australia's most beloved entertainers, stood trial in a London courtroom, not for taxes or controversy, but for the kind of crimes that silence victims for a lifetime. He wasn't just accused, he was convicted. The charges? Sexual assault. The victims? Young girls, some as young as 7. This was not a fall from grace. It was an unmasking. How did a man knighted by the Queen, celebrated in every household from Sydney to London, go unnoticed for so long? How did he use his fame, his art, and his charm to shield a lifetime of abuse? And why, when the truth finally surfaced, did it feel like a nation had lost more than just a man? It had lost a piece of its own identity? This is not just a story about scandal. It's about the terrifying power of trust. It's about the silence that surrounds fame. It's about what happens when a symbol becomes a shadow. And the world is left wondering how it never saw the monster hiding in plain sight. Because before he died, Rolf Harris didn't apologize. He didn't explain. He disappeared, leaving behind a legacy of shame, betrayal, and the chilling question: who else did we celebrate without ever really knowing? For decades, Rolf Harris was more than just a household name. He was a cultural institution. Born in 1930 in Perth, Western Australia, Harris emerged as a vibrant, multi-talented performer who seemed to embody the cheeky, inventive spirit of post-war Australia. He was a singer, a painter, a television personality, a comedian. He invented his own instrument, the wobble board. He painted a portrait of Queen Elizabeth II for her 80th birthday. He hosted children's television shows. And he did it all with a disarming grin and a twinkle in his eye that made him feel like everyone's favorite uncle. By the 1960s, Harris had transcended borders, becoming a beloved figure in the United Kingdom as well. His quirky songs like Tie Me Kangaroo Down, Sport, and Jake the Peg made him an international star. His TV appearances on the BBC and ITV, especially programs aimed at young audiences, cemented his reputation as a wholesome, family-friendly entertainer. He was a man who could do no wrong. But underneath the cheerful persona was a deeply troubling reality. The same hands that shook those of royalty, that drew celebrated portraits and strummed silly songs for millions, were allegedly violating children in secret. His crimes were not a momentary lapse or a late-in-life scandal. They were systematic, spanning decades, hidden in plain sight by his fame, his reputation, and the blind admiration of a public that never asked questions. The time period in which Harris thrived, particularly the 1960s through the 1980s, was one of uncritical celebrity worship. It was a golden age of television, a time when trust in entertainers was almost sacred. To appear on the BBC was to be sanctioned by decency itself. To perform for the Queen was to be beyond reproach. And yet, this very structure enabled Harris to exploit the innocent. He operated within a world that would never suspect him. That world handed him awards, titles, and platforms. In 2006, he was appointed a Commander of the Order of the British Empire, CBE. He had already received the Order of Australia in 1989. But none of these honors would survive the storm that was coming. When Operation U-Tree, the massive UK police investigation into sexual abuse by public figures, was launched in the wake of the Jimmy Savile revelations, Harris's name surfaced like a ghost from the past. His crimes, once whispers, became courtroom testimony. His victims, once silenced by fear and disbelief, found the courage to speak. And as the truth unraveled, so too did the identity of a nation. Australia, which had proudly claimed him for so long, now looked on in horror. The UK, where he had been knighted and celebrated, swiftly revoked every honor. Media outlets erased him from archives. Institutions that once welcomed his work destroyed every trace. This is not merely a fall from grace. It is a collapse of a cultural myth. And as we revisit the timeline of Harris's life, we must also revisit the system that let him thrive. The silence of institutions. The complicity of admiration. The cost of never asking questions. Because the story of Rolf Harris is not just about one man. It is about what happens when fame becomes a mask and no one dares to look beneath it. Rolf Harris was born into an ordinary suburban family in Bassendean, a quiet corner of Perth, in 1930. His childhood was marked by talent and ambition, traits that would later become both his blessing and his camouflage. Gifted in both art and music, Harris was the kind of student who stood out. He studied at Perth Modern School and later won a scholarship to the University of Western Australia. It was here that his charm began to take shape. His natural performance ability made him not only a skilled painter, but a captivating presence on stage. In the early 1950s, Harris moved to London to study art at City and Guilds of London Art School. He was young, energetic, with a thick Australian accent and a disarming smile. He was exotic, entertaining, different, and the British public took to him immediately. It wasn't long before his talents spilled from the canvas onto the stage and screen. By 1955, he had a regular slot on the BBC, appearing on children's programs. His appeal was instant and magnetic. He wasn't just a presenter, he was a friend. He drew cartoon animals live on air. He sang nonsense songs. He brought the energy of a wild uncle crashing into the living rooms of millions. Children adored him. Parents trusted him. Producers banked on him. Then came Tie Me Kangaroo Down Sport in 1960, a hit that skyrocketed his name across the English-speaking world. The song's upbeat rhythm, strange sounds, and cheeky lyrics became an anthem of light-hearted Australiana. It charted in Australia, the UK, and the US. Rolf Harris was now an international celebrity. But the success didn't stop at music. In 1963, Harris began hosting Rolf's Cartoon Club and Rolf on Saturday, OK? Hugely successful children's television programs that ran for years. His presence on the BBC became so entrenched that for a generation of children, his face was as familiar as that of their teachers or parents. He was the bridge between Australia and Britain. He was harmless fun, or so it seemed. By the 1970s, Rolf Harris had become something of a national treasure. He performed at charity events, worked closely with disabled children, and often appeared in educational programming. His image was polished, family-friendly, beyond suspicion. He visited schools, met children backstage at performances, took photographs with young fans. His proximity to children was not just accepted, it was celebrated. But behind the scenes, something much darker was taking place. The first unusual incident, at least in the official timeline, occurred in the late 1960s. A teenage friend of Harris's daughter, Bindi, alleged that he had inappropriately touched her while she was staying at their family home. At the time, she said nothing. Who would believe her? This was Rolf Harris. She was just a girl. The incident haunted her into adulthood, becoming the first of several testimonies that would later resurface during his trial. Yet through the 1980s and 1990s, Harris's fame only grew stronger. He was commissioned to paint the Queen's portrait for her 80th birthday, an honor reserved for only the most revered artists. He performed at royal events, spoke at official functions, received awards from both the Australian and British governments. He became one of the few entertainers to hold high civilian honors in two nations simultaneously. The escalation of his career masked the escalation of his misconduct. Victims would later testify that Harris used his position of trust to access them. Dressing rooms, backstage corridors, photo sessions, family holidays, he manipulated the environment to create moments where he could act. And because he was Rolf Harris, no one thought twice. His crimes weren't loud or violent. They were insidious, hidden behind the layers of his smiling persona and impeccable public image. In public, he was the voice of cheer. In private, he left behind girls in confusion and shame. The real escalation came in the early 2000s when several women, independent of each other, began speaking out. Still, the allegations were mostly whispered. Media outlets were hesitant. Legal risks were high. Harris continued appearing on television, giving concerts, even publishing an autobiography. He was untouchable. But then, in 2012, Jimmy Savile died. And with his death came the opening of the most explosive investigation in British entertainment history, Operation U-Tree. As victims of Savile stepped forward, so too did the victims of others. The BBC, the public, and the police were forced to ask, who else had been hiding in plain sight? In March 2013, Harris was arrested at his home in Berkshire. It was the first public crack in a flawless public image. But still, many hoped or believed it was a mistake, a misunderstanding. Surely not Rolf, not him. But the stories were too consistent, the evidence too disturbing. And for the first time, the public began to turn. The man who once sang lullabies to children was now at the center of a nightmare, and the world had only just begun to understand the full extent of the damage he left behind. When the trial of Rolf Harris began in 2014, the courtroom was tense with disbelief. Here stood a man once seen as a bridge between generations, a symbol of joy, now accused of violating the very innocence he once claimed to celebrate. The charges were staggering. 12 counts of indecent assault against 4 women, some of them minors at the time of the offenses. But the most chilling part? These weren't recent allegations. They stretched back decades. One victim, who had been a friend of Harris's daughter, told the court he abused her from the age of 13 during visits to his home. He would smile and joke, and then suddenly his hand would be there, she said, her voice cracking in the courtroom. And I would freeze because who would believe me? Another victim recounted being groped during a public event when she was just 8 years old. Harris, she said, had reached around her during a photo op, whispering something vile in her ear that she never forgot. He made me feel like I was nothing, she said. Harris pleaded not guilty to all charges. Throughout the trial, he sat stone-faced, emotionless, occasionally scribbling notes or drawing sketches. His defense team portrayed the victims attention seekers or confused women misremembering the past. But the stories were too precise, too haunting, too consistent. In court, one moment struck like thunder when a victim described watching Harris on television years after the abuse, smiling at the camera, singing to children. She said it made her stomach turn. The world saw a hero. I saw a monster in disguise. The prosecution revealed that Harris used his celebrity status as a shield. He had power, access, credibility, and no one dared question him. He offended in green rooms, in dressing rooms, during charity events, and even while accompanied by his wife. It was calculated, rehearsed, repeated. The jury found him guilty on all 12 counts. When the verdict was read, there was no remorse in his eyes, just stillness, as if the mask had finally cracked, and beneath it was nothing. Outside the courtroom, the public reaction was a storm of fury and betrayal. People who had grown up watching Harris wept, not out of sympathy, but shock. His songs were pulled from radio stations. His paintings were removed from galleries. The Queen revoked his CBE. The University of Western Australia stripped his honorary doctorate. He became a ghost overnight, a man whose name could no longer be spoken without shame. Media headlines were relentless. National treasure turned national disgrace. Rolf Harris, predator behind the paintbrush. Australia's shameful secret, but perhaps the most heartbreaking reaction came from those who stayed silent for decades. Dozens more alleged victims came forward after the verdict. Most could not be prosecuted due to statute limitations, but their stories mirrored the same patterns of abuse. A former BBC employee whispered to reporters, "We all had a feeling, but no one thought it was possible." The hardest truth was this: the abuse wasn't hidden in shadows, it was hiding behind applause. He didn't need to silence his victims. The world did it for him. After serving less than 3 years in prison, Harris was released in 2017 under strict conditions. He returned to a world that no longer welcomed him. Former friends cut ties, institutions disowned him. Yet to the very end, he never issued a true apology. He continued to deny wrongdoing, writing bitter letters from prison and claiming he was a victim of hysteria. In May 2023, Rolf Harris died of neck cancer at the age of 93. His death barely made headlines in Australia. There were no public statements from the entertainment industry, no retrospectives, no mournful tributes. He died as he had lived in his final years, shunned, disgraced, erased. But for the victims, there was no closure. Only the cold silence of justice delayed, and a lifetime stolen. At Aussie Uncovered, we tell stories not just to remember the past, but to confront it. And few stories challenge a nation's collective memory more than that of Rolf Harris. It's almost impossible to overstate what Rolf Harris once meant to Australia. He wasn't just a celebrity, he was a cultural export, a representative of our humor, our charm, our creative spirit. For decades, he painted a picture of what it meant to be proudly, cheerfully Australian. And we believed it. We celebrated it. We handed him the stage, the camera, the trust of children. And in doing so, we became part of the story. But that story was never true. Not completely. Rolf Harris built a career on likability, on innocence, on the illusion of closeness. And it's precisely that illusion that allowed him to manipulate, violate, and silence. He wasn't simply a man who committed crimes. He was a man who weaponized fame to commit them. And that's what makes his case not just disturbing, but culturally devastating. Some people argue that we should separate the art from the artist, that we should remember the laughter, the paintings, the songs, and leave the darkness behind. But how do you separate a career built on children's laughter when that same career masked abuse? How do you hum along to Timey Kangaroo Down Sport, knowing the man who sang it left so many broken behind him? The truth is, Australia didn't just lose an entertainer, it lost a myth. The myth that kindness on camera means kindness off it. The myth that success and respectability protect us from depravity. The myth that evil is easy to recognize. Rolf Harris shattered all of that. And yet, perhaps the most painful truth is this: the signs were there. Whispers were ignored. Victims were dismissed. Institutions protected their image, not the innocent. It wasn't just Harris who failed. As a media, as a society, as a nation. So what do we do now? We talk about it. We name it. We refuse to forget it. Not to punish, but to protect. Not to shame, but to shed light. Because somewhere out there are still stories being hidden behind applause. And if we've learned anything from Rolf Harris, it's this: silence is the soil where predators thrive. Aussie Uncovered does not see Rolf Harris as a misunderstood genius or a complicated legacy. We see him for what the evidence revealed, a man who betrayed the very people who trusted him most. But what about you? What do you remember when you hear his name? Do you feel the weight of betrayal, the chill of realization? Do you feel anger, disgust? Or do you still struggle to believe it's real? Because sometimes the hardest truths are the ones we grew up clapping for. There was a time when the sound of Rolf Harris's voice meant comfort. A familiar tune on the radio, a cheerful face on Saturday morning television, a laugh shared by families in lounge rooms across Australia and the UK. He was part of the national soundtrack, woven into the fabric of childhood, of memory, of what we thought was safe. But not all echoes deserve to linger. Now, when we look back, the warmth has gone cold. The laughter feels hollow. The portrait is smudged with truths we never wanted to see. His legacy, once gilded in honors and applause, now lies buried beneath courtroom transcripts, revoked medals, and the pain of voices that were ignored for far too long. And yet, we remember. Not because we miss him, but because forgetting would be too dangerous. His story is no longer about art or entertainment. It's a warning, a mirror held up to the cost of unquestioned fame, to the children who were told to smile, to the institutions that chose silence, to the public that applauded too long, too loud, without ever really knowing who they were clapping for. Rolf Harris didn't just fall. He took with him a piece of trust we'll never get back. But now you know. You know what lay behind the wobble board and the grin. You know what happened behind the curtain after the camera cut. You know the truth they didn't tell you in the songs and shows and honors, because some stories aren't told on television. Some stories aren't painted on canvas. Some stories are buried, whispered, dismissed for years, until they can't be anymore. And once you know them, you can never hear that voice the same way again.